Welcome to the PDA Parenting Podcast. This show will be dedicated to supporting parents raising kids with PDA autism. I'm your host, Amy Kotha, a parent coach and a mom to a PDAer myself. This podcast is here to provide you with practical insights, real-life experiences, and expert guidance to help you better understand your child and to parent from a place of connection, empathy, and understanding. Whether you're new to PDA or you're already familiar with the journey, you're in the right place. Welcome back to the PDA Parenting Podcast. If you're joining for the first time, I'm Amy Kotha, your host and a parent coach specializing in parenting children with PDA autism. This is part 2 of our introduction to PDA, or pathological demand avoidance, where we're continuing the conversation about what makes PDA such a unique profile of autism. If you haven't listened to the first episode yet, I would highly recommend starting there to get a good foundation. But if you're ready to dive in, let's get started. In our last episode, we introduced PDA as an autism profile that comes with a pervasive drive for autonomy and extreme demand avoidance. And we also touched on the intense fight or flight responses that are often triggered by what might seem like everyday expectations, like toothbrushing, coming to the dinner table, going to school. So today I want to build on that and talk about more specific social characteristics of PDA and how some of those show up in everyday life. Let's begin by talking about masking, which we can describe as demand avoidance in disguise. So masking is one of the most challenging and often misunderstood characteristics of PDA. And you might have already learned about masking because it's not unique to PDA. In fact, almost all of us, probably you and I both, we have masked at different times throughout our lives. Masking can also be called camouflaging, and it's done by someone when they're trying to hide a part of their personality or a behavior, an emotion, a reaction, in order to fit in, to avoid being made fun of or to be judged or discriminated against. So I know when I was younger, especially in high school, I masked almost all the time. I had serious anxiety, including social anxiety. And it was really the only way that I knew how to exist socially without freaking out and running away, which is what I seriously was constantly wanting to do. I even remember being in a class once where everyone was given another student's name and they had to come up with an animal that represented that person. And the girl who had my name, I had known her and been friends with her off and on since kindergarten. It was a small parochial school that we were in. She linked me to a chameleon and explained that her reasoning was because I changed myself according to who I was with. And oh my God, I have never felt so called out in my entire life. I was so seen in that moment. And it shook me because it was a perfect description of what I had been doing. I just thought I was better at it and that it wasn't so obvious. So, masking is often seen in neurodivergent populations, and it's definitely often seen in autistic people. So, autistics might feel more pressure to mask due to social norms that they are struggling with because, autism affects communication and behavior and relational interactions. And PDA autistics just tend to use masking a lot, and they're often described as being incredibly good at it. And when we look at masking that's associated with PDA, we often see that PDAers learn to hide their distress and their demand avoidance in certain settings. So with our kiddos, you're going to see it particularly at school or in public or social settings. And if you're a parent like myself, you're going to hear teachers very likely say, but they're perfectly fine here. We have no idea what you're talking about. She's a model student, only for your child to come home and completely fall apart. So for us as parents, we can hear this, especially if we are unclear with what our kids are struggling with. We're new to PDA, and we hear these things and think that maybe our child is only acting up for us. And maybe this behavior is manipulative or controlling or lazy or defiant. There's so many negative words that can be attached to their behaviors, which is not an accurate representation of what's going on. It can make us feel, though, as parents, like we are doing something very, very wrong. And we often get judged for this as well. But the reality is that it's actually a sign of how hard these kids are working to suppress these natural responses to their environment. They're not feeling safe enough in these other environments to express their true emotions. So they get pushed down, saved up until they're back with their safe person. And you might think at first, okay, sounds adaptive. What's wrong with that? But the problem is that masking, especially on a regular basis or for really long periods of time, is affecting the nervous system. And this can lead to meltdowns, shutdowns, like I said, as soon as they return to the more familiar, safe environment or safe person, then it comes out. But this can eventually lead to burnout, which can be extremely debilitating, both physically and mentally. And for parents, it can feel confusing and frustrating because, especially when we have professionals or other caregivers who don't see the behaviors that we're witnessing at home, it leads us to burnout as well. And believe me, I totally get this because my kiddo was absolutely incredible at masking. She was even able to mask in front of my husband for months and months. At the time, he worked away from home, so he'd be get home maybe late Thursday night, leave on Monday morning, and she was able to hold herself together, push it down, and mask from Friday morning until Monday morning when he left again. And that actually led to problems with our relationship because he didn't believe me or understand when I tried to explain to him what was happening. He didn't get it. And he didn't see it. So it is vitally important to understand the concept of masking so that you can realize that these big emotions are bubbling under the surface, maybe all day, maybe for weeks or months, and they need to be processed. And if they're bubbling under the surface all day at school, they need to be processed once they get home to a more safe environment. And when they do blow up, when they are letting these feelings out, it's also important to understand as parents that it is not personal. It's nothing against us. And it's actually a sign of more secure attachment and safety that they're able to show these emotions to us and share with us. And it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like a good thing, not at all. It seems very counterintuitive, but that's what's happening inside their nervous systems. So we need to remember parenting a PDA child is about parenting and caregiving a very sensitive, vulnerable nervous system. This is brain-based parenting, and this is why it's such a paradigm shift from traditional parenting. So let's move on now to some of the social challenges in PDA. Because PDA also presents some really interesting and often confusing social dynamics that are different from other autism profiles. It can get very confusing. So, in typical autism profiles, it's often that social anxiety or a complete lack of interest in social interactions might be a bit more common. But PDAers can actually be very socially aware. And in fact, I've met several families where their PDA child thrives in social settings and they actually can hit their flow state in social interactions, but it still has to be on their terms. So like my child used to do in her younger years, I talked about, I think in the first episode, um, when she was younger, she was better able to control the group of friends and she was better able to control the other kids that she played with. She would control the play and what everyone did. And it was easier for her and it didn't feel like a threat to her or her autonomy. But then as she grew older, that started to change. So when kiddos have this social piece that doesn't look like a typical autism presentation would look, it makes them harder to diagnose, especially the girls. As we know, girls' autism presentation tends to be more subtle and it's often not even recognized until adolescence or sometimes even later. And these social dynamics that I'm talking about here, they play a very big part in that delay. We can hear as parents that these kids don't fit the autism profile because they can maintain eye contact. They want friends. They might have friends. They might be very charming. They might be very verbal. These types of autism presentations are included now in what the autism community is hoping will lead to more of an evolution of the diagnostic criteria because we're missing out on services for these kids when they're younger. Because, for example, I advocated for an appropriate diagnosis for both of my daughters. I felt strongly that each of them, in their own way, were on the autism spectrum, and they were both misdiagnosed for years and years. My PDA wasn't diagnosed until she was 16, which I just think is ridiculous. While PDA kids might seem socially inclined, there's still a catch. Socializing can still trigger their demand avoidance. So that's why you might see fluctuating behaviors. And PDA really is a fluctuating profile. So one moment your child might be fully engaged and chatting and laughing with their friends and having a great time. And then the next moment, they seem to be withdrawing or becoming super controlling or upset. And what could be happening here is that while they might be greatly enjoying the interaction, they're simultaneously navigating this series of internal demands, trying to manage everything that's going on, the social expectations, the rules, and maybe even just the overall energy that it takes to keep up with their friends and like stay in the game. Social interactions have so many caveats to them that so many different things could occur that can cause confusion or problems with their peers. I remember when my daughter had a group of girls at school who absolutely loved hanging out with her. I think it was maybe fourth or fifth grade. And, she was so fun and creative because that's another fantastic strength of PDAers is they often have very vivid imaginations. They're great at role play. But this was a recurring issue that would throw everyone off because another strength of PDAers is their strong sense of justice. And if one of her friends stepped over a line during their play, my daughter would immediately report it without a second thought. And as you can imagine, this left the other kids a bit confused and often led to hurt feelings. So, meanwhile, this is happening, and my daughter could not understand why they were upset because she was simply following the rules, right? Like she's been told. So, it can get a little confusing, and understanding this dynamic really is key. It's important to recognize that while a PDAer might enjoy socializing, it often requires a huge amount of energy to manage these situations. I also hear from various clients, and I've seen it in our own family, that after a fun play date or even in like an overnight play date or a family gathering, you might notice your child having sudden mood swings or social withdrawal or possibly even an aggressive meltdown. And it's not that they don't want to be social. That's not the issue that's going on here. Usually it's they just need time to recover from these internal demands of performing basically in a way that has felt safe to them. And if it was a long play date, like an overnight, the amount of masking that they might have had to do and just the amount of energy that they had to exert in order to keep up with their peers, it builds up and they have to push it down and hold it in, and then it comes home and it can really explode. So as parents, we need to try hard to remember this so that we can plan ahead. So we need to maybe consider what type of tools or activities help our kids regulate and be prepared to have these available for them. And if you prepare yourself psychologically that this time is going to be tough and you're going to need to maintain your regulation in order to co-regulate, makes it a lot easier. And we'll talk more in the future about how to do that. But for right now, just know that this is a normal thing for our kids, and preparing and planning is everything. So just be ready to help support their nervous systems and remember that it is coming from their nervous systems. So here's another way that things can get even more nuanced for our kiddos. PDAers often use social strategies as part of their demand avoidance. I have heard them described as masters of negotiation. They love to use humor, delay tactics. They can make elaborate excuses in order to avoid demands. These kids are smart. They can be incredibly charming and resourceful in these moments, and it can add another layer of complexity to something that is already complex. As an example, there was a time when we had hired a private tutor for my daughter. This woman, she was a middle-aged woman, and my daughter was maybe third grade, and she had been missing school. School was it was an issue, so she'd been missing school and needing some help catching up. So I hired this woman to come to our house to tutor her. I thought that would be like really great. It's our safe space, and thought that was a good idea at the time. So the two had only worked together a couple of times, and one day the tutor asked if she could speak with me outside before she left. And she said to me, I don't know how to say this, but I wanted to check in with you and make sure that you're okay. And I was like, okay, I'm fine. Why are you asking? And she said, well, Maya has been telling me that you're going through a very contentious divorce, and she's been scared about what's happening. And she said you're really struggling right now. And I was like, okay, hold up. What? Like, turns out my lovely daughter had constructed a very involved story, was not true, by the way, and had been sharing it over the past couple of visits with her tutor rather than doing her math work. And when we tried to put a stop to that story, she doubled down and came up with even more elaborate details. So literally the tutor decided that she didn't think she was a good fit for Maya's needs, and she quit working with us. So pretty sure she believed everything my girl had said and thought I was some type of horrid mother. But hey, wasn't the first time and it wasn't going to be the last time. But that was the first time that I had heard such elaborate storytelling in order to get out of a demand that was just a massive demand for her. So while, like I said, some PDAers might appear to be socially fluent, right? They often have excellent verbal skills. My daughter spoke before she walked, and she spoke very well. They might still struggle with understanding certain social cues. One of these includes hierarchies. And this is another confusing trait of the PDA profile because most PDAers often don't see or accept hierarchy. So they might not grasp why they can't negotiate with a teacher the same way that they do with a peer, or why certain rules apply differently in certain situations or settings, or why parents expect different behaviors from a child that they wouldn't expect from another adult. My child's kindergarten teacher was completely perplexed by the fact that my kiddo would talk to her like an equal and wanted to help her peers rather than sit in her seat and act like the other students. That was a very, very hard year for all of us. So that is something as a parent of a PDAer that you need to keep in mind and that you will likely see. The last common characteristic I'm going to talk about today is obsessive behaviors. And interestingly, PDAers are often focused more on people than on things when it comes to these obsessive behaviors. And this can manifest as an intense need to control what their person of interest says or does or how they act. And it's also common when the PDAer is a child that this person is their mom or their primary caregiver because it's also normally the person that they feel the most safe with. I often hear other moms talk about how their child won't let them, for example, leave the child's room, or the child controls where they sit in a restaurant, or how often they hear, stop it, shut up, don't talk, or I'm not going to let you leave. So, when parenting your child, you're going to also notice other PDA traits, including those, and you will likely see mood swings, impulsivity, um, a love for novelty, and of course, this strong resistance to conventional parenting methods like rewards and punishments. These are a huge hit to autonomy. Sticker charts are a no-go for us. PDAers also don't typically respond well to routines that are set by others, which is quite different from typical autism support, where normally we're helping with routines, and routines and structure can be extremely supportive. So that's just another example of why traditional approaches to teaching or discipline, they often fall flat with our PDA kids. Now, all these factors play into the social dynamics that can make PDA really tricky to navigate, both for your child, for you, and for all the people around them. But the more that we understand this profile, the more we can better support our kids. We can give them the space and the tools that they need so that they can manage these demands in their own way. Because we need to remember, we are raising adults here. We need to teach our kids how to gain these skills and be able to move forward with them into adulthood. Thanks for joining me again today. And remember, parenting a PDAer is a journey, and you're not alone in it. If you found this podcast helpful, I'd love it if you would please subscribe, leave a review, and then follow me on social media to stay connected. I'll see you next time for more insights and strategies to help you navigate the path of PDA parenting.